I'm afraid, slightly formal, and what I've been trying to do in it is situate Deleuze's work and work in this particular book within a much larger context. And it's a context which, if I may lapse into slogans for a minute, departs from, on the one hand, a Heideggerian construal of the relationship between philosophy and literature, philosophy and literature, and on the other hand, becomes more philosophically rigorous by being more philosophically formal than the sort of approach one would find in the work of Derrida. To that extent, Deleuze is, to my mind, a more conventional philosopher, though what flows from it, I think, is remarkably unconventional. So it's in part from a work in progress. What kept arising as I was doing it is that the project of Deleuze's Lceture was always becoming part of a wider and perhaps more generalizable possibility for architecture, and thus also for philosophy. It goes without saying that these named counters, one use of them. What this has meant here in practical terms is moving in and out of Deleuze's project, the project of folding, complexity, the chaotic, etc., in order both to situate its limits and to place it in a context that holds its radical possibility by reintroducing what can be taken as the critical, that is, the actuality of critique. Because the point I want to make is that inherent in a certain reading of folding is what I see as a trap, and that's what one could perhaps describe as an idealized formalism. But there within another reading of it is an inherently critical dimension. But this other reading will involve some sort of interpolation into Deleuze's own writings. As part of this opening sketch, and in employing a certain terminology both too quickly and with an unfortunate violence, it should also be noted that, again in general, rather than straightforwardly Deleuzean terms, the division between function and style is the opening in which complexity is folded. And indeed, I could stop at that particular point, because in some sense this is the point I want to make, is that once you want to argue that architecture, to use a formulation of Eisenman's, need no longer symbolize function, at that point there is an opening. Now that opening of necessity defies prediction, and one could develop an argument in what way it defied prediction. And it's in that opening, in both architectural and philosophical terms, that the fold can be infolded, if you like. That folding becomes a strategy that emerges in that opening. And this is why, for example, in holding these two things apart, one can begin to see what an architecture, and indeed what a philosophical thinking that eschewed prediction is going to be like. It is precisely this opening that will, in sanctioning chance, allow for the infinite. The existence of the inalienable presence of mediation, however, means that any recourse to terms such as complexity, the infinite, chaos, multiplicity, etc., all of which we take to be good things, and we need to ask why we take these things to be good things in some way, will have a necessarily critical dimension. I would want to go further and suggest that remaining oblivious to the primordiality of mediation marks out the forgetting that characterizes formalism. A forgetting, moreover, that includes the emphatic presence of power. And if you like, of the political, once again, to talk in slogans. What must be worked through here, rather than it's either giving or providing a strictly sequential argument, will involve trying to trace the presence of that which is already present in the position of any argument concerning architecture, especially the already given architecture-philosophy nexus. It is perhaps too obvious to argue that what is at stake in thinking through the relationship between philosophy and architecture will be a series of implications. The problem of unfolding already present implications is that such an undertaking may become, indeed could become, a simple recitation. Moreover, the narrative in question will be formal. Indeed, it will be that particular formalism which, as was suggested, emerges as inevitably demanding the work of forgetting. The relationship between formalism and forgetting indicates what I would want to describe as the effective presence of time in architecture. What is forgotten is the presence of time in the fold, in folded time, if you will. And it will be in clarifying what is intended here by time that the limits of formalism, as well as, perhaps ironically, at times, the necessity for a certain formalism will emerge. Tracing the already implicated will always entail privileging the display of multiplicity over the simplicity of sequential simples. The multiple is, of course, more than a complex of simples. And in saying that, just in saying that simple point, that the multiple is, of course, more than a complex of simples, in that possibility, what is announced is the fundamental distinction in philosophical terms, in historical terms, between Leibniz and Descartes. For Descartes, the complex was that which was reducible to its simple components. It's there, if you like, in the formulations of Cartesian geometry. For Leibniz, on the other hand, the complex was never reducible to a series of simples. And with that moment, we have a challenge, i.e., how do you think that particular construal of complexity, that is necessarily and definitionally irreducible? As I said, this division that emerges, if you like, in the 17th century, but noted with enormous acuity and care by Deleuze, this division between Leibniz and Descartes is a disassociation that has important implications within the history of geometry. Though, for our concerns in this instance, what it also raises is how that difference is itself to be thought. In other words, if there is going to be a difference between two modalities of thinking, how is that difference to be construed? The opposition between the complex and the simple, therefore, is not a binary. It's not an either-or, and is not to be thought as such. How it is to be thought, once again, defies prediction and sets itself up as a challenge. To that extent, the very nature of that difference already functions as, if you like, a mise en abîme for the whole problem of thinking otherwise. Again, the position of the fold, and thus its being positioned in and within architecture, raises almost inevitably the question of philosophy's relation to architecture. How could it not, when the fold is thought and then rethought within philosophy, present within Leibniz and Deleuze, even if not necessarily present in their text's own specific architecture? Before taking up what is at work in any approach to the architectural fold, it is worth in passing dwelling on this already complicated relation. And yet it must be recognized that these provisional divisions are themselves already implicated in any thinking of relation. In other words, within my tortured prose, what I'm trying to get at is that once you begin to think through what's at stake in the concept of relation, you have to recognize that that which is given in order for thinking to take place in the first place is already in relation with that which you have to think. So this question of relation is, if you like, primordial. And therefore what calls, if you like, for thinking is precisely the precise nature of relation itself. Again, and this time what is intended is a compounding rather than a simple deepening of the activity. What is involved here is another return. In this case, one which raises the problematic of naming. In each instance, what pertains is a name. Architecture, the name. Philosophy, the name. Relation, the name. Complexity, the name, etc. What will have to be recognized is that the name, or these names, will itself, in their plurality, name their own being, and what that being is an ineliminable site of contestation. In other words, that the name philosophy, from within the position that I would want to argue, the name philosophy, the name architecture, names the contest to take over the name. But it's a contest and a site, if you like, of a primordial conflict that is always marked by power, in the precise sense that there are pre-given answers as to what is to count as the architectural, what is to count as the philosophical, etc., etc. So naming, rather than naming anything essential, will name that particular contestation to take over the name. And that, if you like, is again the point I want to suggest, that contestation, that original conflict, is itself will always involve a disequilibrium of power, if you like. It is precisely the presence of this disequilibrium that works to cite political considerations. What follows from this setup is that it is this construal of contestation and conflict, and it will be appropriate with equal force in relation to chaos, the many, etc., which will demand the conception of difference as differential, namely a construal of difference that involves neither variety nor diversity, and thereby resists the imposition of both liberalism and a certain form of pluralism, and gives a difference that incorporates value, and thus which necessitates recourse to the ontological modalities of being, if you like. The ontological. To account for and sustain it as a formulation of difference. The implicit critique of the modality of positive suggested here will be equally appropriate if what is posited is either an unmediated deregulation, the sort of naivety found in Schury's writings, or an idealized formalism. Both positions enjoin the necessity of forgetting that difference is differential. What is forgotten is provisionally to be named in this way, as the constraint that is introduced and maintained by the name. The constraint is that which is always already given in order that something be recognized or be architecture or philosophy, etc., etc. And that is why the project of the utopian is going to be so deeply problematic. It may be worthwhile taking up the obvious, beginning with the obvious, with that which is at least initially straightforward. What this will mean in this instance is a beginning that takes definition as a point of departure. Definition is, of course, a move within naming. To define is to give the meaning's precise location, establish the identity of its site, establish the site as involving a necessary and pre-given singularity. If the singular is to endure, it always takes place after the event, and in the constitution of the event as an event. The precision at work here, however, the precision that intends a founding singularity, the singular site, no matter how putative, is the precision which is also adapted by, and thus adapted to, a certain take on naming. What this will entail here is that the easy divisions within the calculation of the either-or, it's either this or that, the division that characterizes what is presented as either architecture or philosophy, and thus precluding the possibility of any interrelationship, this whole modality of thinking will demand to be placed in abeyance. Another mode of procedure, and thus another logic, will have to come to endure. An endurance, however, which will save the specificity of architecture and philosophy. What is being asked for, therefore, and that which insists here, will be the stand of complexity. Any thought of the fold, therefore, is already, from the start, a thinking of complexity. The problem, as a problem for architectural thinking and practice, cannot be simply contained. Moreover, the challenge presented by complexity is there with equal significance in relation to any take, as Deleuze makes clear, on the word the infinite. This latter term, while it may seem to harbour traces of the theological, which here may be taken as inappropriate, will be fundamental to any understanding of the use made of Leibniz by Deleuze. It may be that complexity and thus the infinite are already present. If they are, then what will have to be taken up is the nature of that presence. What does it mean to argue that complexity is not something that occurs after the events? I make something complex by adding things, but complexity is always already there. If it's always already there, how do we think that notion of presence? Again, if this emerges as the task, what it signals is a centrality to any thinking of the architecture-philosophy relation of ontology. And what I mean by that is very simple, is that if what we're concerned with is a complexity that's always already there, that's always already present, what does it mean for it to be there? How do we understand its existence, the existence of the already complex? And indeed, this is the charm of, to me at least, of Deleuze's book on Leibniz, to adopt an informal mode for a moment. This is precisely what Leibniz is concerned with. The Leibnizian monad contains within it the infinite possibilities proper to it. It contains within it a principle of change that drives the monad on in order to actualize itself or to actualize that infinity. And what that means is that from the start, the monad has to be thought as always already complex. But the beauty of this is that the always already complex does not preclude the possibility of there being a fixed determination. It's what Leibniz means by the monad having a perception. It's having this particular form at a point in time that be given a date. But it doesn't follow from that point in time, that existence the monad has, is coextensive with the monad itself. The monads will always unfold other possibilities. And it's precisely that other possibility that resists prediction, but in some sense is always already inscribed, enfolded, if you like, that is there, at least in the writings, when Eisenman writes about the Rebstock Park project, or more intriguingly, John Reichman writes about Eisenman writing about it. Part of the project is to locate that which is yet to be realized. And the architectural challenges will also be a challenge for philosophical thinking, is how do you inscribe the yet to be realized in something that is actual? As many recent commentators have pointed out, John Reichman's work being perhaps some of the most apposite, the question of complexity figures at the heart of the enterprise of the fold. Reichman, writing of Deleuze, notes, and I quote, complexity does not consist in the one that is said in many ways, but rather in the fact that each thing may always diverge or fold onto others. While the elegance of this counter of the Heideggerian with the material is both accurate and timely, the problem is understanding the nature of the claim inherent in the words may always diverge. The problem really to me is with this word always. Indeed, I will come on to other instances of the word always. It will be the precise problem of the temporality and ontology of the always that will be approached in relation to constraint. If this is always a possibility, how do we understand this always? Is it free to act in this way? Or is it always in some sense mediated by something that's outside? At this stage, however, complexity has a certain generality. It works in Eisenman's own incorporation and utilization of the technique of the fold in the development of the Rebstock Park in Frankfurt, as well as in Deleuze's own interpretation of Leibniz. What will come out here is that folding, complexity, the many, the infinite, and a number of matching terms all pertain to a similar state of affairs. The real difficulty in this instance is that what can be taken to be marked by these terms resists automatic summation, resists being summed up. Now that will be important, because what is at play in the idea of being able to sum up, being able to state absolutely what is happening? In sum, it involves the following. Of the many possible determinations, most relevant here is that summation is linked to finality. Finality needs to be understood as a form of completion. Ontologically, what is involved is that what it is that is present can always be presented in its totality. Temporally, what is entailed is that what is enacted as complete. It is given in the instant as complete, and consequently endures in its completion. Now, for what it's worth, that precise formulation, or that formulation echoes the formulation of Descartes in the second discourse on method, where he says, in talking about the object of knowledge, and I quote, "Whoever knows that thing knows it, and knows it absolutely, knows as much about that thing as can be known." In other words, there is an epistemological exhaustion. If you know it, you know it absolutely, you can totalize it, you can represent it as it is. And it's precisely this possibility that is being challenged in Leibniz's writings, and always had been challenged in Leibniz's writings, and it's this that Deleuze is trying to bring out. Any reworking or change needs to be understood as either modification or supplementation within such a view. In each instance there is an end. Even though this description of completion is accurate, there still remains a necessary determination that needs to be acknowledged. This determination is the mediating presence of the specificity of constraint. In order to approach constraint, it becomes essential to position it in terms of the reciprocity of relation inherent in the unfolding of the interrelationship between architecture and philosophy. In invoking constraint, what comes to be raised is the recognition both of the inimitability of relation and that relation is not simply a formal presence characterized by neutrality. Relation accounts in part for the site in which the determinations of tradition, the determination of that which is already given, are themselves enacted. The word of relation, as was suggested, already figures in the question, a question to be given whatever reciprocity will be necessary of the architecture-philosophy relation. It is not that this particular relation raises problems, the acuity of which are greater than, for example, the philosophy-literature relation. It is just that any thinking of relation will always yield that which is difficult to formulate. An integral part of this difficulty will be time. How do you incorporate at the present, as a modality of the present, that which is yet to happen? The aspect that must be noted from the beginning is that there is an already existent relation between philosophy and architecture. The mutual implication involves, at the very least, three connected determinations. In the first place, the already present treatment of the architectural by philosophy. In the second, the incorporation of architectural terms into the construction of philosophical texts. And finally, in the third, the differing architectures of philosophical texts. While this may be to construe the relation from only one position, nonetheless it works, and at the same time, to indicate the relationship's already existent nature. Moreover, it attests to what can be described as their necessary interweaving. Interweaving, in spite of promising an interpretive texture, will have to be given more than a formal setup. This obligation is not ethical. It arises because of the actual nature of thinking any relation. What accounts for the relation, thus the interweaving, is the effective presence of a specific logic. What this entails is the recognition that the determinations, and thus to extent also the specificity, of both philosophy and architecture are always already determined. The straightforward consequence of this is that the enactment, and therefore also the instantiation at the present, of architecture and philosophy are both to be construed in terms of repetition. And indeed, this is the more general point I would want to argue, that it seems to be the way in which one should think time in regards to the history of architecture, regards to the history of philosophy, is in terms of repetition. That is why, for example, if one thinks about such a thing as postmodern architecture, what is so clear about it is that I would want to argue, and have done, that it is no more than a shift in the history of ornaments, because what is repeated is precisely the same concept and construal of functionality that had always been present. What happens is that it is given a different form. In other words, that what marks that development, so-called, is simply a repetition of the same. If there is a move, it's a move in the history of ornament, in which if you take something like the Richmond project, it's very clear that anything could have been clipped on the front of the orthodox office. In other words, that the relationship between what is clipped on the front and what appears behind is simply a relation of indifference, and it's that which marks, in a very conventional sense, the construal of ornament. So repetition provides us, if you like, with a way of thinking through what is happening in the development of time with architecture and time with philosophy, and this will be true of other names. While recognising that it will demand another undertaking, one the detail of which cannot be pursued here, what follows from the recognition of the inescapable presence of the gift, the already determined presence, and the present as the site of its reenactment, is that the temporality within relation is itself to be thought in terms of repetition. Not, it should be added, an essentialised repetition, but a repetition whose own self-conception will allow for complexity. What this means, in other words, is that repetition will itself have been subject to the process that it names. The repetition of repetition may amount to its redemption, in that it becomes free from the automatic determinations given to it by its incorporation into the logic of the gift. It will be this sense of repetition which involves what appears to be paradoxical, but which marks, in fact, the way in which one can talk about the abeyance of dominance, namely a relation of non-relation in regard to repetition, in regard to tradition's dominance. A repetition, if you like, that takes place again, but for the first time. And what I want to do, if you like, is situate precisely Deleuze's thinking within an attempt that allows for the dominance of this particular construal of repetition. Part of any understanding of complexity, therefore, will hinge upon taking the logic of the gift, taught within the purview of repetition, into consideration. What this will mean here is that complexity, as with its other related terms, will be mediated by the complex of repetition, will be mediated by the inescapability of the logic of the gift. Indeed, its mediation will give to complexity the possibility of its being actual complexity, actual rather than simply ideal. Formal idealism, the ideality of formalism, will have to eschew that which makes of complexity its being complex. Now, while there is no actual discussion of the problem of time in this sense within Le Pli, time figures throughout. It is most aptly captured in the often cited last lines of the book. And I quote, "We remain Leibnizian, even though it is no longer the accords which express our world or our text. We discover new ways of folding as new envelopes. But we remain Leibnizian because what is always of concern is folding, unfolding, refolding. Parce qu'il s'agit toujours de plier, déplier, replier. It's the toujours, the always, that is of interest. How is it that what is at stake is always this? What is signalled by the always, and very importantly, is a thinking that resists the apocalyptic on the one hand and the utopian on the other. It also resists the historicist's fascination with continuity. Parenthetically, it should be added that what it raises is the entire problematic of the always. And if one had a super-duper computer, you could do a count of the number of times the word always appears in the history of philosophy. Two examples. It's there in Heraclitus. The river is described as rayon ae, always flowing. It's there in Plato's dialogue, the Cratylus, in which the ousia, the essence of the form, is described as always being the same as itself. Always. Now it's clear that Deleuze's always comes much closer to the Heraclitean than the Platonic. The always here, however, raises the same interpretive problems that were raised by Reichmann's reading of the fold. A reading in which, as was indicated, he reads it as the possibility of the always diverging. Here it may be helpful to return to Reichmann's own formulation of Eisenman's Glenstock Park project. Again, writing of Eisenman's adaptation of the folding notes, and I quote, "In Eisenman's words, one must make present in a space its implicit weakness or its potential for reframing. The principles of his perplication are then that there is no place and no space that is not somewhat weak in this sense. And weakness is imperceptible prior to the point of view that one normally has of the space or the place. Reframing as both a project links in an intriguing way Leibnizian monad, and thus to what is folded within it. In other words, that what is being brought out of Leibniz's own self-conception of the project is that the challenge for architecture, and indeed this is also going to devolve to philosophy, as always, running after, is how does one think the principle of change as internal? But the point, I suppose the point I want to make is this principle of change, this internality in which the infinite is contained, is always mediated by a constraint. And one needs to take the word constraint terribly seriously. Deleuze, for example, argues in chapter 6 that chaos will be an ensemble of possibles. It will be an ensemble of possibles, but what is possible is itself already given. So that ensemble of possibles has to work in relation to that which is always already determined. And it seems to me that it's precisely that interconnection that opens up what it is that complexity is. Finally, Deleuze is acutely aware of this problem. He says, it is with Leibniz that there surges into philosophy the problem which never ceased haunting Whitehead and Bergson. Not how to await the eternal, but what are the conditions in the objective world, what conditions in the objective world will permit the subjective production of the new. In other words, that the problem that emerges both architecturally and philosophically, taking the primordiality of relation, recognizing that this problem of the always, if it's always this happens to be something new, is that the idea of the new, once we move beyond the temporality of fashion, or the banality of the new, which is the postmodern, in which there is nothing new except for decoration, then the challenge that devolves is precisely thinking that delicate project, which is the possibility of the new, and thus the possibility of another architecture and another philosophical thinking. Thank you.
I think, especially given the constraints of time, that it would probably be more productive for people to kind of think about the questions and interventions they'd like to make, and gather all that together at the end of the afternoon, because in fact we only really have another 2 hours. So, with your permission, I'm going to continue straight on and ask Jeff and then Greg to speak.
No,
sorry.
No, you first. So introduce Greg.
I will. Okay. I'm going to ask Greg to speak.
Yep.
Now, did you know you couldn't do that? Okay, doesn't matter.
When I was asked to come today, I was very excited, and then as I began to prepare a talk, I started to have some trepidation because as an editor of an issue on folding in architecture, I really didn't want to go back 8 months in time and collect a catalog of projects that exhibited characteristics of folding and present them to you. So instead of doing that, and instead of going through this harangue of images, I'm actually going to keep the talk today towards a sensibility of folding, which I think might work with very minimal visual representations of what that might be. So I'm hoping the talk today will be a little bit more speculative in that sense. I think that taking that kind of liberty as an architect is possible, though, because Deleuze in Lceture is probably his most compositional. And I think this idea of folding is primarily a compositional idea, whether taken in philosophy or in architecture. So what I want to do is lay out a few compositional strategies today in the abstract. I've realized in editing this issue and also in ruminating on it now that it's complete, that any discussion of folding in architecture can easily become locked in on a series of formal techniques that may or may not produce folded effects. I think it's important to say that they may or may not produce these effects. And I think Andrew's talk today also makes me very nervous because it's a kind of cautionary few words about exactly what folding might be. As an architectural designer, I found in a sensibility of folding that there are certain implications for composition which nonetheless do result in new forms. So I wouldn't want to say that the architectural manifestation of folding won't be folded forms. I just want to talk about how you actually get to that point today. To my mind, the best definition of folding has been put forward by culinary science. When cooking, folding is a gentle overturning of two or more ingredients so that you attain a mixture in which the characteristics of the individual ingredients are still present. Now, the idea is that this folded mixture is nonetheless continuous. So the principles of a folding in architecture would want to maintain, first of all, difference. But second of all, it would want to put that difference into a smooth composition which is continuous. So that this idea of folding, I think, puts a question to architecture as to the development of continuous yet heterogeneous mixtures. Now, the second characteristic of this culinary idea of folding is that there's some joint manipulation that puts these things into relation. In cooking, that happens to be a gesture that begins maybe with the shoulder and ends with the wrist. I think that's also a very interesting characteristic that could open up a discussion of, let's say, expressive gesture as a way of organizing folds. I'll see if we can get to that today. In the spirit of this nearly expressionistic mode I want to take today, that actually makes me a little bit uncomfortable, I think that I would want to talk about compositional continuity, despite, Andrew, your concerns about the historicism of that. I think that if you outline the characteristics of what's an emerging sensibility of continuity, you realize how the fold actually is going to plug into architecture. But there are two assumptions I think you have to take with the fold to understand this continuity, that it's first and foremost a compositional idea, and that the compositional techniques it suggests to architecture may be different than the techniques it might suggest to philosophy or some other discipline. But I think that the single most important aspect of the event today, that rather than introducing a new decompositional technique, what I'd like to do is try to put the fold into a compositional mode, and I'll talk about the difference between those today, and I think that they hinge on the issue of difference, differential compositional techniques versus, let's say, a kind of decomposition based on difference. But I'll get to that, and it may be actually alarmingly crass for an architect to be talking about these issues. The folding gets its differential continuity through what Deleuze calls intensivity. Now, intensivity is the idea that an internalization of external factors contributes to a kind of singularity. Now, I think the issue of complication and complexity is key here. I think the way Andrew's laid out this idea of complexity, we're talking about a kind of unfolding, or what Deleuze calls an endogenous fold. And I think that when you're talking about complications, you're talking about external forces and context, and then you're talking about a kind of internalization of contingency, which is seen as an exogenous fold. So I think it's important to say that there's unfolding and folding, there are endogenous and exogenous folds, and there are relations of intensivity, which is internalizing a context, and then there are extensive gestures, which is the kind of unfolding of some internal order. And now those two things are not dialectically opposed, they're always in a kind of dialogue, right? But I think the fact that they're in that dialogue means that any discussion of the fold has to resist a kind of, let's call it formal idealization, and has to remain very attentive to specific and local contingencies. That any strategy of compositional folding will always have to be localized, it will always have to be intricate, and it will have to be intensive, despite certain extensive characteristics or principles that would be generalizable. much of the visual material that's been available to describe what these strategies of folding compositions might be have been developed as geometric models by morphologists. The primary two were Darcy Thompson and René Thom. What's curious is that in Thompson's writings, there's a kind of retrograde humanist nostalgia, but in the geometric analyses, several people have found a kind of profoundly new ideology. Now, I think that ability to shuttle geometry into architecture is something that's maybe a very easy move. This same kind of retrograde rhetoric and new form, I think, is exhibited by several architects that are presently interested in folding. To my mind, there's a visible discrepancy between the rhetoric of difference in discontinuity and the formal implications of these new systems, which seem to be about developing new continuities. The primary thing I want to take from this morphological discussion, though, as I show the images, is that although Thom I'm not going to show because I think it's actually too difficult to go into the geometries, but in Thompson and Thom, these morphologists are looking to describe the development of form in response to contingent influences. And Thompson is the first person to do that. So again, what we'll see in those is a kind of continuity of internal structure that allows one to make species, but at the same time, the internalization of context into those individual species that allows any single individual to be a new species, and more so, any context to generate a new species. So there's a kind of critique of type and critique of speciesization that happens in Thompson and Thom. For a canonical model of folding for me is the example of the plica. Now, the plica is what's referred to as a fusional multiplicity by Deleuze. And the idea of the plica is that it's a seemingly single strand that's composed of a multitude of much finer fibers or plicae. So the plica and the plicae are exactly the same thing. It's a question of position, orientation, and scale of clarity when you're looking at these things. So that the plica is simultaneously one and many, which is the principle of multiplicity. Now, folds could be considered fusional multiplicities in the sense that disparate elements are united into provisional unities, not absolute unities. They're never finished. And they're never finished because they maintain the disparate characteristics of their constituent parts. So an act of bending elements together to form a plica is an act of folding, or an act of plication, or an act actually of multiplication. So that the part and the whole, the many and the one, don't ever share a transcendent order. All they share is the act of being plied simultaneously by some external force. So a strand of hair is a good example of a plica. It's a composition that's simultaneously singular and plural. It's one of the only linguistic terms we have in our bodies, but we accept the multiplicity of them. Hairstylists are in the practice of composing and cutting these multiplicities through gestures of combing, brushing, setting, cutting, etc. In order to incorporate heterogeneous elements of hair, for instance, into a singular composition, the haircut, there are thousands of tiny mutual deflections and reorientations that happen in response to a kind of general bold gesture. But that general bold gesture can't be disinterested in those individual tiny characteristics. It has to deflect itself in response to them. So those kinds of gestures that have to maintain particularity but try to develop a kind of provisional continuity, are the gestures that architects would be interested in, that wanted to be involved in a kind of fusional multiplicity. So that the implications of Le Pli for architecture should involve the proliferation of connections between free entities. But these shouldn't be limited to simply techniques of folding. They should be involved with manifold techniques, compositional techniques such as bending, twisting, pleating, braiding, screeding, combing, weaving, etc. so that the resulting multilinear network of interweavings, intertwinings, and intercations are complicated so that they can't be reduced to any one organization. And I think that's the difference I would make between a complication and a complex. Now, the principle of the complication is that there's always a continuous process of differentiation that occurs. Now, before I go into a continuous process of differentiation, I'd like to invoke the inherited view of continuity that we've been given. Probably the most recent is actually by Colin Rowe and Bitcover, which is about geometry also, and it's about a geometry that stays absolute, fixed, and transcendent. So if I could have the first two slides. Bitcover systematized a theory of proportion by uncovering a single spatial type in Palladio's architecture. This type he was developed through a series of variations. Now, these variations were basically the identification of differences between 11 of these villas, which he then eliminated in order to invent the two before that. That's coming. Can you back up? So the difference played a very critical role to Bitcover and Rowe in their development of the 9-square grid type. 2 years before Bitcover, Colin Rowe in the Mathematics of the Ideal Villa also used the 9-square grid to crossbreed two pairs of twins, Corbusier's Villa Savoie and Palladio's Villa Rotonda, and Corp's Villa Stein and Palladio's Villa Malcontenta. I need you to back up.
He said that the first slide.
Oh, really? Go to the next two then.
You can't take a photo.
Oh, do you want?
Those are very well-known drawings by Bitcover.
So that's the analysis of Malcontenta and Stein, and then the idealized 9-square grids that allow those two to be compared. Now, in Rowe's analysis, what he did was identify differences in order to eliminate them as mere variations of a larger general theme. Now, no doubt, there's a fertile ground for deconstruction now to reinvigorate those differences as a critique of the ideal villa type. Rather than doing that, what I'd like to do is give you the examples of Darcy Thompson, where variation and differences are actually put to the service of developing a type, but a type that's an open type, and it's a type based on deformation and transformation, not of some ideal general principle, but of a new principle at any moment along that transformational line. So the Thompson examples here of taking a certain species of crab and then laying a provisional geometry rather than essential geometry over one of those and compressing, dilating, bending this kind of supple surface became a way of registering performance. And it became a way of registering internal performance and contextual influence. So that in the example of the crayfish here, you see a progressive enlargement of the front section, which is the expansion of an eye. Now, Thompson would measure the deformations of that grid, put that against information about the depth and light levels at which that crayfish was living, and find out that there was an algorithmic correspondence between the deformities of the geometry and the context itself, allowing him for the first time to make an argument about not the evolution and selection of mutations, but the internalization of contextual forces towards the development of form. So that's a kind of morphological breakthrough that was allowed by the geometries. It's also a breakthrough that's never argued by Thompson. It's only argued by the geometric diagrams, which is curious. So that with Thompson, we're suddenly given a model of transformational, continuous differentiation rather than the Rowe and Bitcover model of continuity through identicality. So that one system is continuous and identical, the other is continuously differentiated, which I think is the key difference. Now, both this geometric system of Thompson and and the system used by Tom. These are called hypersurface deformations. Tom's is a folded hypersurface deformation, which I don't think we have time to go into. In both geometric systems, they're capable of describing both evolutionary transformations, which are based on the external selection of characteristics, and involutionary transformations, which are based on the internal selection of mutations. Both systems together contribute to the construction of a kind of semi-permeable boundary between unity and dispersion and between the inside and outside of an organism with its context. Now, this twofold motion of folding and unfolding is what Deleuze and also Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus have termed a twofold deterritorialization. Now, in this example of twofold deterritorialization, what you have is a kind of contextualism that should be familiar to architects, where the individual element is deflected by its context, but it's also a kind of active performance that it gets a new mobility in its context through this. So I think these examples could lend themselves towards a kind of contextualist strategy, but at the same time we're talking about a critical contextualism here. We're talking about a kind of alien organism in its context being deflected by it to gain new performance and new territory in it. Now, this logic is what I would call intensive curvature, which is based very much on the idea of a logic of curvilinearity. Now, a logic of curvilinearity can't be reduced to a style of curved forms. It's not just neo-Baroque or expressionism. As I've already argued, a curvilinear sensibility is characterized by the involvement of outside forces in the development of new form, so that if internally motivated and homogeneous systems were to extend in straight lines in this instance, curvilinear developments result from the incorporation of external influences on that extensive system. So that curvilinearity in architecture as a principle of folding would not take necessarily the form of a fold, but would take on the form of multiple complex deformations in response to not only context, but program, structure, economics, aesthetics, political, and contextual influences. So the logic of curvilinearity argues for the kind of active involvement with external events. And this could take the form of folding, it could be bending, but it's always going to be deformed. It will always be curvilinear in that sense. So that within these single curvilinear lines, or what we could call gestural lines, you'll be able to identify disparate elements within a continuous organization. So that the curves imply a fluid logic of connectivity in the expression and unification of a constellation of multiple points. Now, this would be a multiplicitous gesture. The most important principle of these inexact curvatures or folding is that no two inflections are ever the same. Therefore, no two inflections can ever be idealized. This has been attempted in texts such as Cook's The Curves of Life, etc., where by looking at Michelangelo, he's able to argue that the spiral is the kind of essential structural organization for all forms, and I think this would want to be actively resisted. So that a logic of curvature suggests that any stable form is produced through the interactions of thousands of tiny differential forces which lack any single order. So that from the play of differential forces, stabilizations appear and disappear. So the difference in this case doesn't destabilize. What difference does is actually produce order. It produces a deformed order that's open to constant influence. Etienne Jules Murray is for me a kind of paradigm which, unfortunately, I left the slides. But he was a scientist involved with the recording of movements, pulsations, and flows of the body. Now, his recordings were abstract gestures that were capable of expressing forces that were expressionist. So I want to revive this notion of expressionism and curvature in the act of folding. Francois Dauguenet has argued for Murray that, quote, the whole of his work consisted in showing what one could learn from a curve, which was not merely a simple reproduction. It was from and with the curve that forces could initially be calculated. It was easy to obtain the mass of a body as well as the speed it was going. From this one could induce the force that had set it in motion and the work expended to produce this action. Not only were the slightest nicks and notches in the line due to certain factors, but they enabled the determination of resistances as well as impulses. And Murray also was a very key influence on Bergson and his idea of duration. So that rather than a kind of simple reading of continuity, these curves actually involve the duration of multiple forces in a kind of single perception for Murray. Now, the compositional models I've described are all based on the interaction of multiple and imperceptible forces of unrelated elements that end up codifying into a mutual organization. Now, in these cases, stability emerges neither from the bottom up alone, which is complexity theory, nor from the top down, but is negotiated differentially between parts and wholes. This allows for various degrees of cohesion and unity. So in Rowe and Vitkover, where the ideal villa was the absolutely unified villa, in the Thomson diagrams, what you do is have varying degrees of unity. So it's about degrees of cohesion, degrees of wholeness, rather than absolute part or absolute whole. Now, this development is timely as it's becoming apparent that deconstructivism has failed to develop an adequate theory of architectural composition, despite the protestations of its practitioners. It's probably only developed a theory of decomposition. Now, this isn't an attack on deconstruction. I think it's an attack on deconstructivism in architecture, which is, again, to say there's a difference between compositional techniques in architecture and composing philosophy. The failure of deconstructivism is most likely due to its proclivity for arresting difference in conflicting forms. And this is a commonality between Venturi with complexity and contradiction, and even Wigley and Johnson in deconstructivist architecture. So that rather than exploiting the potential for differences in displacement in the idea of the fold, I think it's important as architects that we look for the possibilities of new unities and new cohesions. And I think that many of the deconstructivist architects see the fold as a new technique for the disturbance of fixed forms, right? For the sequeling, the fold becomes a way of differentiating it as a kind of safe difference, an imposed difference, rather than for the production of new forms of housing, new forms of urbanism. So that again, I would say that the fold implies a kind of alternative fusional difference rather than a displacing difference. And it's going to be very difficult to exploit that compositional quality as long as the rhetoric surrounding the entrance of philosophy and architecture is involved with its displacement of architectural order. I think the fold actually suggests new compositions and new orders rather than the displacement of the old ones. So, thank you.